Cool, 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 cool. All right, well, you know how this goes. Ask questions as it goes. Um, we'll stop talking about whatever you want. This is more for you guys. But what I wanted to do is like driving in the wet is a lot. And so, normally what we would do is we would get together and we would drive and we'd talk about some things and we'd do a track walk. But so much of wet driving is like mental and understanding the principle. And then there's a little bit of the like what works in ACC and what doesn't. So
Right.
I threw some slides together mostly for me because otherwise I'd be just bouncing around talking about shit for hours and we'll never get anything finished. So I just threw some slides up to kind of keep me on track. But there were also
Can we do a basic real quick first?
yeah,
Okay.
I have slides.
I figure you
I,
probably already were
I,
thinking about this.
I have slides.
Okay.
I'm good. I'm good. I'm good. So a couple things I wanted to talk about was really about like the mental game first, about getting your mind around driving in the wet. Because I mean, 90% of this is going to be mental. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about setup stuff. I've got some slides in the end that are going to be some basic setup stuff, but most of this is going to be like just getting out and doing laps and practicing and kind of understanding the differences between wet and dry and what you need to be doing. And just keeping a few things in mind as you're doing it so that you're not just overwhelming yourself. Right, so that'll mostly be it. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about like the wet line specifically and a little bit about racecraft in the wet because I know some of us are really fast but we don't race as much. Some of us are racing and we're trying to get fast. So I wanted to kind of dabble in both a little bit. But as stuff comes up, ask me questions, and I'll bounce around to if I have a slide on it, because I'm a weeb nerd and have slides. So the first thing about driving in the wet, right? So I will say that 95% of driving in the wet is mental more than physical. Like conceptually, you're doing the same thing driving in the wet as you are in the dry. You're pushing to the car's limit of tire grip and using the most grip that's available, and everyone else is doing the same thing, right? The biggest reason that a lot of people don't quote unquote like driving in the dry, they don't practice and they don't prep for it. So when a wet race comes up, they're just not ready, and so then they go, "Oh, I don't like driving in the wet." It's really more about just understanding what you need to be doing differently and making some subtle changes to your driving, and sometimes making some subtle changes to your car. I mean, we could do a fixed wet setup league where we just do the default wet setup, and almost all of this would apply kind of universally, right? There's the natural car control skills that you guys already know about, so we don't really need to talk about that. But there's also just like the ability to be able to adapt to low grip conditions, whether it's a greasy track or a wet track or a track with standing water on it or a really, really hot track that can be slippery because it's really hot. Being able to kind of drive in these sort of conditions is important because especially on longer races or races with dynamic weather, you don't know what the weather is going to be. So you need to be able to know what to do in order to adjust while you're driving because sometimes you can't come in and make a change. Right? And then the last thing is just like the psychological confidence of knowing that you know how to do it. Right? There are a lot of races that I've started where I beat the guy before I even got started because I was just more confident and ready to do it than they were. And they may be able to put one fast lap down in the wet, but they can't do 30 minutes. They can't do an hour, and so it's going to work out fine, right? So you guys are a step ahead just to the fact that you've shown up and want to talk about this sort of stuff and kind of get your heads around it, because this will benefit you in the long run and kind of all the wet driving you do.
And if you guys don't already know, Devin does do kart racing very well.
Yeah, I do a lot of regional karting. I do some car racing. I live in Washington, so it rains all the time. Like, if I don't drive in the rain, I don't get a chance to race. So I actually really like it. So okay. Okay, so one thing I wanted to throw up here first before we get started is pay attention to changing track conditions. It's something we talk about in the dry often with track temperature and air temperature and kind of track grip, but with the weather and rain, you also need to pay attention to the adjusting differences over time. So I took a screen cap of the upper right side of the kind of like pit garage screen where it shows the little clock with the 10 and 30 minutes. That's basically what the weather prediction looks like it's going to be over a period of time. And so, it's important to kind of be aware for that in your races because there are going to be a lot of times where like you might make a setup for what you currently see, but the race may not be that way. And so it's important to kind of be familiar with like what's the next 30 or 40 minutes going to be because you can even set a car up that might be worse in the very beginning of the race, but just a flyer in the end because you're paying attention to the weather and other people aren't. So I do a little PSA for checking the weather because it's generally going to be useful. In setups, I also do the same thing when I name my setups. If I have a setup that's like demonstrably fast in really wet conditions, which is terrible and dry, or other things like that, so that I'm aware of what I'm setting up for, so that it's just less likely to catch me out that all of a sudden, it dried up in the middle of the race and I had wet tires on or whatever the case may be. So, does anyone have any questions about this?
No, but that actually was what I was going to ask about, or have you talked about to begin with, because a lot of people don't come into the server and pay attention to the minutia that's on the screen when you first get there.
Right. Yep. I have another slide in here that talks about making sure you actually have a wet setup on the car, because so many people get so excited to go in a race, they run in a hit drive and they're out on dry tires and they wonder why their car won't turn. Or they don't pay attention to the track temperature and they go out with a setup that's designed for something like 30 degrees or 38 degrees and they wonder why they can't get heat in their tires because everything's set so low, right? Things like that will help you a lot in the long run and also teach you to drive on the fly. Because there are times where I don't have time to do a setup. The race is in 10 minutes and I'm going to jump in and I look at the temperature of the track and I say, all right, I'm going to throw a bunch of tire pressure in it and deal with it. Right? But once you have more experience, you get a little better at kind of figuring out what's good enough, right? And that'll help you.
Another thing, now that you mention it, there is a very subtle difference in the now time, 10-minute time, and 30-minute time, because if you look, there are 8 segments underneath each one of the little rain clouds, and that means technically medium rain. If it was a straight line of 4, that's heavy rain. Mm-hmm. And that's something that you just kind of, if you glanced at it and missed it, you wouldn't realize that it's going to be ridiculously wet here shortly.
So we had the opposite happen when I came back for practice yesterday, where it was raining and then dried out near the end. And so I got out as quickly as I could and threw in a bunch of wet laps as fast as I could so that I could get just a little bit familiar with driving on the wet again. And then, it dried out and I threw some dry tires on it. It was fine.
Yeah, there's actually sometimes a plus and a minus, meaning in 10 minutes there'll be a plus number. And if it has, say, just 4 segments, technically 4 segments by itself is light rain. The plus means it's going to be raining this amount and possibly harder in the next few minutes. That's the biggest difference.
Yeah. And it's not a 1-to-1 accurate, but it's a good rule of thumb. If you just generally know that the weather is going to get worse, or you just generally know that the weather is going to get better, right? That can just even be helpful in a race where if the weather's really bad and people are driving all over the place, it's good for you to just calm down, wait it out a couple minutes, let things happen, and the track will come to you, and you don't need to worry about trying to push in the rain. Cool. Any questions about this? Has anyone actually even looked at this?
I
was checking it out earlier.
Yeah. Super useful. And also those little stripes and stuff like Larry was mentioning too. It's they're so minor and small, you might not notice it unless someone calls it out. So. Okay, so talking about the wet line. This is kind of just a wet line 101 sort of thing. Compared to driving in real life, ACC gives you a ton of grip in the rain. So you really only notice wet line differences when it first starts to rain and the track's kind of fast, greasy. But it's a good thing to just be mindful of conceptually, especially when you're driving with other cars. So in the dry, you've got a dry line, and we all know what that looks like. It gets really rubbered in, the track gets darker in places, we drive over it, we go faster, because sticky tires plus race rubber on the track equals fast lap time, right? Fantastic. In the rain, though, that gets flipped on its head, because rubber on rubber becomes very slippery, and so it makes it difficult to slow down, it makes it very, very difficult to turn. So what you end up doing with the wet line is it's just a minor variation of your traditional dry line. You're not shifting the corner too much. You're not changing the way you orient it a lot. But I put this diagram on the screen so you can get a sense of your wet line is traditionally a little bit deeper into the corner. You're normally on the brakes a little bit earlier, and your turn in is maybe just a little bit. I will call it deeper into the corner because you're still apexing around or along the same point, but it's just the fact that you're turning on a place where your tires aren't on the rubber. And so that you don't squirt across the top of the rubber when trying to turn, you're turning on pavement because rubber on pavement. Yes.
You said there was a diagram?
Yes.
Where?
Are you looking in the Discord?
We see your screen.
Yeah.
We see your screen, David.
Yeah.
and watching the cars cycling around in Barcelona, we're not seeing the presentation.
Oh, well, that's why I was asking if you guys could see my screen earlier.
We could
can see your screen.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Hold up. Yeah, I'm
You're
just
just sharing ACC right now.
yeah, I'm
brother.
just talking, and that makes no sense. Okay, hold on. Do.
As you can see
Sorry.
in Exhibit A.
Yeah, right.
Sorry, we didn't mention before.
It's all good. It's all good. Can you see this now?
See a black screen.
God damn it.
Yep.
Let's see.
We're doing well here.
We're doing great. We're doing great. Let's see
If
the
we're
score.
racing at midnight, we got it.
Have you tried turning it off and on again?
Ah, try this.
There we go.
There we
There
are.
we go.
Yes,
So
Discord. Yes,
can we
Discord.
start from the beginning?
No.
Good job, Jeremy.
No. It's fine. It literally, I threw the slides in the chat before we got started, so you guys have that.
Right, I did check it out.
Yeah. All the bullets are just talk track stuff, so you didn't miss anything. All right.
So
But
you're late apexing everything is what you're saying?
it's not so much late apexing everything as you are just turning deeper into the corner. Like on a traditional dry line, you're really trying to make the corner as wide as possible without going deep into the corner. Right, so basically where the U kind of bends, you're not trying to go that deep because any foot you go farther into the corner is a foot you have to come back, right? In the wet, the only difference here is that you're just trying to get off that rubber when you get the car turned. So you may be going a little bit deeper into the corner by just, 6 inches a foot, 2 feet, depending on the type of track, right? And it all kind of depends on the type of corner and where you are because there are going to be some corners where you just can't avoid the rubber on the race line going in, and you just need to be aware when you turn in that the car won't be as responsive. You need to either be on the brakes a little longer, or you'll need to turn in a little slower to get the car to turn, because it's just, like turn one is a perfect example, right? It's difficult to get the car turned in properly without just being there, right? And you don't have a lot of place to go off to, so you have to kind of drive the same dry line, but just slower, if that makes sense.
Is this what they call square the turn?
Yes, this is what we call squaring the turn. Yes, exactly right. Yep. Because you end up basically adding a little bit more of a pivot in that, like, where the car gets turned. If you notice, the apex is in the same space, right? Because you're still trying to get that run out of the corner and get a good exit out of the corner, but it's just getting the car off the rubber is the important part. You'll see it in a lot of places too, like when you're overtaking other cars, like I think I may have posted this earlier this week. It was a Max Verstappen video of him in 2016 in Brazil, where he's driving around the outside of people all the time. He's using karting lines, right, where his rubber on wet pavement is more grippy than wet rubber on wet tire. And so he's got way more traction when he gets on the corners or gets off the corner to drive around people. And so it just looks like he's got so much of a faster car. It's just that he's using more of the track surface more proactively. Driving in the wet is all about proactively finding grip, right? And so you're not always going to stick to the same line all the time. You're not always going to end up doing the same thing every corner, every lap, because part of it is just sussing out where there is traction and using that to your best advantage. When we get to talking about setup a little bit later, we'll talk about like how to use traction control and how to make some other adjustments to the car to make it easier once you've got the grip. But it's important to know that like you do need to be a little more proactive in the wet than you do in the dry to kind of find that space on the track where there's grip, especially when you're around other cars and you're doing other things. Does this make sense? At least conceptually?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Let's change your sign here. Boop. I already talked about this. Cool. So Marcus did a reference video of driving in the rain in Barcelona. So I'm actually not going to do a track walk like we normally do because we'd spend a lot of time basically showing you the exact same reference points, but backed up like 25 feet, maybe. Right?
About 2 car lengths.
Yeah, that's about right. About 2 car lengths. Your reference points in the wet aren't going to be dramatically different. Really. Like, there's a little bit of common sense that you're kicking in where you're saying it's slippery and I'm moving at a decent amount of speed, so I need a little more room to slow down and move and turn, right? But, you know, if you're braking if you're going to turn 1 and you're braking between the 100 and the 200 board I brake around like the 125, almost the 100 in the dry, I might start braking around the 150 in the wet, just to get myself a place to start. And if there are other cars around me, I might brake at the 160 because I don't know yet how the other cars in front of me are going to adapt to the rain. And I need more time to be able to let the car finish, like the cars in front of me, finish doing what they're doing before I try to like skirt by them or make a move or anything like that, right? We've talked about this probably in a couple other clinics before when we're driving in the dry, but in the wet it's even more critical that when you're racing around other cars, you have to give them time to finish doing whatever it is that they need to do when they're getting out of your way or crossing the line in front of you, because they also don't have a lot of grip to work with when you start to move by them. And so if you, if a car is spinning in front of you, or if a car kind of steps off line and you don't let it finish and you kind of just throw your nose in there, you both have less grip to work with than you normally did in the dry anyway. And you're actually more likely to crash because you've just been too assertive and, you've waited, you've gone too early. That makes sense. So that anticipation is going to be even more critical than in the wet, than in the dry. Sorry, it's going to be more critical in the wet than it is in the dry because you guys are working with fewer spoons when it comes to the amount of grip you have on hand. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool. So if you haven't had a chance, take a look at Marcus's lap. We do the reference laps not because they're like the, oh my god, the fastest laps, because honestly, driving fast in the rain is really, really subjective. Right? Like the rain's falling, the grip level's changing all the time. What will be fast 10 minutes from now is not going to be fast, now. You just need to kind of be in a general window of consistency where you can kind of stay, like the delta time here is your best friend, right? If you can stay within about a second to half a second in the rain, that's fantastically fast. Right? Because you've got a lot of people falling off the road. You've got a lot of people outbraking themselves. You've got a bunch of changing conditions that happen. So it's very difficult to, just knock out a wet lap time over and over and over and over and over again. It's more about consistent feel and balance of the car so that you can just stay on the road. And that's 90% of the battle right there. Okay. We talked about this a little bit, but, racecrafts in the wet, anticipating the cars. Pay attention to how hard you initially apply things. So, like, initially applying the brake, initially releasing the brake, initially turning in. Because if in the dry, you're working with, let's say, 100% of the car's tire, in the wet, you're working with, let's say, 40%. And so it's very easy to overwhelm the tires. It's very easy to overwhelm when you're turning in, overwhelming the front tires. It's very easy to lock up if you jump on the brake too hard. And so, feeding yourself into the corner, I'm betting a lot of you are kind of rolling your eyes and being like, Davin, you're not saying anything that I don't already know. Because driving their wet... Say again?
I said wrong.
Right? But
Definitely wrong.
It is exponentially different.
Right? But driving in the wet is honestly the same thing, but different to driving in the dry. Right? If you're driving in the dry, you have to feed in your brake points. If you're driving in the wet, you have to feed in your brake points. You're just feeding in more brake point. You still have to be smooth. You still have to be smooth on the brakes. Like, all of those things still apply. Right? You've just got a little less grip, and you've just got to get comfortable with the car moving around underneath you a little bit more. It's that comfort level that makes you fast in the wet more so than anything else. I could even give someone a crappy setup in the wet, and if they're comfortable, they'll be quicker than somebody who's not comfortable. Right. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so these are just basic setup tips I want to talk about, and the reason why I threw these to the end is because your experience is going to vary on setup in the wet by a lot. And so I normally would throw this in the very beginning and we talk about a lot of things, but we would probably spend 20 minutes talking about setup changes, and I didn't feel like it, so I put it at the end. Wet setups for ACC are actually pretty good as a place to start, right? The biggest thing I tell people when they're trying to get started in driving in the rain, put on the default wet setup, do a bunch of laps, and get comfortable. Don't try to make a lot of tweaks. Like, the rain's going to make more changes to the car than the car setup will for the first 35 laps, 40 laps, right? Just get to a point where you can start to kind of get comfortable with the car, and then you can start making some adjustments. Quick wins, though, that are always going to help you is higher wing settings, because more downforce, you're going slower, you're going to have less grip, you want more aero balance in the car. Closing up your brake ducts for better tire heat management, right? Your rubber tires that are normally really hot from driving in the dry are being cooled down by rainwater. And so brake temperature is an amazing tool to manage tire temperature, especially because we need to keep the tire temperatures here higher, or the tire pressures here higher than we would in the dry, right? A wet tire pressure is typically between 29 and 31 psi. You can go a little bit over though in the rain because you've got water cooling you down. Now that being said, channeling my inner Marcus, remember earlier when we were talking about changing conditions? That higher tire pressure will come to hurt you if the track dries out while you're on a wet tire, right?
That will change quickly too.
Very quickly. A wet tire is intentionally softer than a dry tire so that it can generate heat in a wet environment, right? So if you ever get a chance to ever mess with a race tire ever and you touch a wet race tire, they're softer and they're more squidgely and they've got a softer compound because they need to be able to generate friction a lot easier than a dry tire does where it's going to be generating load. So that's great when it's raining, right? It is awful when it's drying. It even will come to a point where if you're on a wet tire and can't do a pit stop, so like in these races, in these 30-minute sprint races, if it were to dry out in the middle, it'll be beneficial and faster to search for puddles in the track where you can cool your tires off and cool them off rather than just destroying them on a drying track. Right? So being aware of kind of what your tires are doing and how they're reacting is important. And also giving yourself a little bit of leeway on tire PSI wouldn't hurt you. So like for me, if I'm at 30.5, I'm pretty happy, right? Because then the track can kind of change and I don't need to make adjustments right away. Increasing ride heights to clear standing water and things on the track, but not by a dramatic amount. My current setup that I'm using, that stealing a line from Pope, is probably like a 7-toes setup. I've only raised the car about 4 mil. So it's not a lot, but it's enough so that like the front splitter isn't digging into any puddles. Even though I want to avoid curbs and things, it's enough that if I do touch a curb, it doesn't just bounce me over. It kind of rides me up. I can make some setup changes to dampers and other things to try to get the car to do a little bit more, but the reason why I didn't include them here is because your experience is going to vary, right? Like I said earlier, a driver who's more comfortable in a shitty setup in the rain will be a lot faster than a driver with a perfect setup that's not as comfortable. And I'll find way more time by just carrying momentum than I will in setup changes massively in the rain. There's some things we can do that are more advanced, but I don't want to include those here because you're just kind of absorbing rain driving. And as we do more laps in the rain and the coaches do more setups, we'll throw more setups in the rain. I think Pope already threw one default in there. But that's one of the reasons why I don't include things like damper settings and differential settings and other things. It's a discussion for another day. Traction control is your friend, but to a point. The ST specifically has like this rudimentary, like powered by Windows Vista, traction control. So it's not as sophisticated as the other GT3 cars. So you don't have as much of a tuning window as you would on a car that maybe, like let's say the Ferrari, the 2020 Evo, where I can do TC1 and TC2, or even something like the Lexus that has a TC1 but more variability. So, for driving in the rain, I normally recommend folks stay within about 5 to 6. TC7 in this car is just for some reason just handicapped. I don't understand. Like it just cuts so much power and it hurts you on the exit so much that to me I don't think it's worth it. Some folks might use it just to kind of get started, but the amount of cutting the car does to me doesn't make it easy to be comfortable because now you're right and you're not really accelerating out of corners. So I'd say probably stay in the 5 to 6 range. ABS is the same thing. Right? Because in a dry scenario, the ABS is juddering to kind of help you, with your braking distances a little bit. And in the rain, too high of an ABS can work against you because you go to the brakes too suddenly and the ABS kicks in too soon. And so the brakes are just juddering all the time going in the corners, so not actually stopping you. So, I normally say 4 or 5 is probably a good place to start. And then, I'd rather folks adjust brake bias than adjust ABS, to be honest, because a more rear-wheel brake bias will help you kind of not lock the car up as much. And so, run something like a 52 or a 51 maybe for brake bias. And then, run a lower ABS setting, maybe like a 4 or a 5. Yeah, probably be in the right space, right? These two things are not going to find you like oodles of time. It's just more to get the car comfortable. Tire alignment, same thing. Like I typically use my dry fast setup for tire alignment and then make changes to suit for the condition. So like I might run a little more caster in the wet because I want a heavier wheel in the wet just a little. And I might run more camber if the track is going to stay wet. But like we talked about earlier, if the track dries out, then that camber is going to destroy my tire when it gets really hot. So sometimes it's just a matter of dealing with it. Right? So you don't want to get stuck in this rabbit hole about driving in the wet that like you do 2 laps and you make a setup change, or you do 3 laps and you make a setup change. You want to do like 20 laps and then maybe make 1 change and then do like 20 more because you'll find more time doing the 20 laps than you will doing 2. Right.
Devin,
Yo.
quick question for
Yo.
you. I'm actually in the wet. I'm running less camber on the rear just to have a little bit more contact with the tire and the track whenever it's possible. So I'm trying right now 2.6 degrees instead of 3.1. Do you think this is a very good idea or shitty idea?
No, it's a good idea in a way because, well, it's a compromise, right? So the tire being more straight up and down will roll more easily in the wet because it's square to the ground, right? But when you put load on the car, it won't be as square because it's sitting more straight up, right? If anything, I would say it would be a good idea to manage tire temperature, right? And then kind of start from there, because it all depends on the length of the race and what you're trying to get out of the tire for that length of the race. I run more camber on these sprint races because it's like, I'm going to use this tire for 30 minutes and throw it away. Never see it again, right? So I'll abuse it a lot more than like an enduro, where I might need to hold on to this tire for 3 or 4 or 6 hours, right? So to kind of maybe answer your question, depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
In my situation, I'm trying to get as fast as I can on the throttle, and have more grip, like not in the middle of the turn, but a little bit on the exit. I don't know if that makes sense.
I mean, it does. It does. That's a hard one for me to answer without watching. So like when I get done being a PowerPoint nerd, I'll jump on board with you and watch you a little bit. Because if I'm trying to get better traction out of a corner in the wet, I'm going to look more about car positioning, and I'm going to look more probably on traction control and a few other areas of like where I am on the wet than a tire alignment change. Because the track condition is going to change so much that, you know, by the time you come back around 2 minutes later to get to the same point in the track, it's going to be wetter or drier or a little different. So I'm going to look for a bigger yard sale change than alignment.
Yeah, if nothing else, at this point, he's getting into a very tight minutia of the setup anyway.
Right. Exactly. Yep. You know, if it was going to rain consistently for like 6 or 7 hours and never change, then I might be like, oh, it might be worth making some changes down to that degree. But if the weather's going to change in 10 minutes, then all of your work's going to get thrown away. So.
Yeah. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I would say, if anything else, maybe a bit of a driving style adjustment would probably benefit you in the long run of the same thing, Marcelo.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll take a look at this.
Yep.
I'll keep practicing.
But
Thank
I
you
mean,
very much.
the thing with driving in the wet is like, and I'm being serious about this, like you can have maybe a 1.5 to almost 2 seconds gap in the wet that can be okay if the drivers aren't super consistent, right? In the dry, you definitely will notice, right? The guy's just gone. But in the wet, I mean, I can drop a car and eat up that 2 seconds in a second, right? So I more look for like a setup that I'm comfortable with, that I'm kind of generally around the guys around me, so that, you know, if they drop a tire or make a mistake, I can just drive right by. And they probably won't catch back up even if I'm moving slower than them, because the amount of time I've gained by not falling off the road is greater than what they're going to overcome with the faster lap time. Like I don't care about fastest lap time in the wet, honestly, unless everyone's like just like on it the whole time. It typically doesn't work out that well. So. Okie dokie. So I threw a setup slide on here because I wanted you guys to just be super aware of all the little things you should take a look at before you make sure you're driving in the rain. Like, I know this is going to sound a little rudimentary, but like I make these mistakes all the time too. So if I make these mistakes, I'm going to assume you guys do too. First of all, it's like making sure you actually have your wet setup on your car when you go out to drive. So that's why I circled like the name of the setup up top. I just made sure to circle the setup thing to circle it. You know, the rudimentary school of thought is that the brake pads 3 or the 3 pads are your wet pad because they're not as aggressive and they don't bite as hard. And for a sprint race, that'll kind of work out okay. I've also read in other places that brake pads 2 will also work fine. But I typically run brake pads 3 in the wet. I just don't mess with it. And then also making sure you actually have the wet tire on. Because I've had it where I just didn't think about it, ran out, and I was on slicks in the rain and wonder what my car didn't want to turn. So, PSA, check your setup before you drive.
Hey, Davin, quick question there.
What's up?
When you have in the setup name like 7 toes, or I think 12 toes was another one that we had, what does that actually mean?
Oh, okay. So that's Pope. It's Pope, but the terminology works really well. So Pope got us indoctrinated with this thing of being able to measure how comfortable we are in the setups that we have, right? And so we use the scale from 1 to 10 toes, right? So a 12-toe setup is something that's really fast, that we're really comfortable with, that all I need to do is kind of eke out a little more time through driving, but the car does great. Where like a 7-toe setup is, I don't really know if this is the right direction or not. I'm quick-ish, but I'm not really fast, and so I still may want to take some more time with it. And so it's an easy way for me to remember when I go back to do a setup, like, was I fast with this? Or was this shitty? Right?
Cool, got it.
Yeah.
Pope's his own kind of guy, guys.
Yeah, it's weird, but it works when it works. So... All right, let me see here. What were we talking about here? Oh, okay, so some things that I talked to Marcus about that we wanted to make sure to bring up here. So one was making sure you had your web setup equipped. 2 is practice racing in different conditions. So, Brian and I were talking about how in the league races, we rarely race in thunderstorms or terrible conditions. But it's still good to get some, experience in heavy rain. It's definitely good to get some experience in light rain, because light rain is kind of like that weird greasiness that's almost like a fast track on an early day. And also when the track is drying out or changing, you'll find yourself in a light rain condition all of a sudden, or you'll find yourself in a transition condition all of a sudden. And so it's good to just, get as much practice as you can driving in the wet, whenever you can, right? The other thing is, if you can, try to practice with multiple cars on the track, either with AI or here, like what you're doing today. And the reason for that is because, with more cars on the track, we'll push more water off the track and we'll create dry lines, which will affect the tires dramatically differently. And so I know some folks will do, let's say 100 laps driving in the rain all by themselves, get a lap time that they're happy with one time, and then show up for a race with 35 other cars. There'll be a dry line, destroy your rear tires, you'll be mad, and finish 28th. Right? But if you're more familiar with it and used to it, you'll kind of know where to manage. And also, you'll sometimes adapt different strategies to manage your tires for longer. So what I mean by that is there have been some races where I know the track is going to dry out later in the race. So I can't change tires because I'm stuck on a wet tire. So I will push like crazy for the first 15 minutes because I'm trying to open up as much space as possible for the pain I'm going to experience later when the track starts to dry out and I have to do a bunch of different stuff, right? In other cases, like if I know the rain's going to get worse early on or later in the race, I may just stick with the cars around me for a while and let them drive themselves off the road because the weather is going to hurt them more than I'm ever going to hurt them. And then they can fall off the road and I can just drive by without having to do as much work, right? But the more you're on track with more cars, the less stressful it'll be. Because I know driving in the rain seems stressful, and it seems even more stressful when you have cars around you. It's just because you only have like 5 files of driving in the rain right now, right? Compared to driving in the dry, you probably have 1,000. So the more laps you can get, the more comfortable you can get. The more comfortable you can get with the car in suboptimal conditions, a little bit of oversteer here, a bad push there, that'll help you so that when you start racing and the car doesn't always do what you want, you just drive around some of that rather than being like, oh, damn, my car won't turn. Because it's all relative, right? If my car doesn't turn, but the guy in front of me's car turns worse than my car doesn't turn, my car turns great by comparison. So it'll be okay. Does that make sense? I just said a lot.
And this last point here on the screen, it says learn to hunt for water. Also, every one of the tracks has a bit of a camber in different areas, so the water will trace to different areas of the track. Mm-hmm. I know that Kyalami has a lot of different places where the water will run around the outside edge of the track, and then other places it's on the inside. Now, granted, that's not a track we race at, but you might want to pay attention to the lay of the land. And what I mean by that is actually how high the track is on one side versus how low it is on the other side. And you'll notice that, wait a minute, there's going to be more water over here later. Mm-hmm. So you need to adjust your driving style for the corner previous to get to that straightaway where there is a bunch of water on one side. And, there's a lot of minutia, a lot of little things that you got to pay attention to at this point.
Brands is notoriously bad for that because it's got a bunch of off-camber corners that, like in the dry, I'm like, oh, it's great. Track will take care of me and the car will hook up. But then in the rain, it just pools water there, right? And so you're driving with somebody who's not as familiar driving in the rain in Brands, and they just drive right into a big old puddle of water and spin. And you're like, awesome. That's great. Especially in these big races, right? It's really important to really know track topography. because, I don't know where we're going to qualify. We could be up front, we could be in the middle, we could be in the back. And especially if I'm in the danger zone being in the middle of the back, I need to know track layout, because there are going to be certain times where someone's going to try to go 3 wide into a corner that they wouldn't be able to do it in the dry, so why even try in the wet? And it would be better for me to just get on the brakes and let cars drive by me and watch them all crash and then make up all those spots 3 or 4 seconds later than trying to squeeze through a tiny narrow space when it's already hard enough. So, Larry, you bring up a very valuable point. What questions?
Devin,
Yeah.
can I like a question on the previous slide?
Yeah.
I tried the brake pads 3, and it was not as great for me as the brake pad 1. I had more heat coming out of my brakes, so I could hit my tires a little bit more. So I had a little bit more pressure, and I don't know, maybe grip on it. And whenever I tried the brake pads 3, I was trying to brake at the same points, but it was not working out for me. I had to brake a lot earlier than that. So does it really matter for a 30-minute sprint to have brake pads 3 or brake pads 1?
Well, so the thing that I would consider is, can you keep that pace with brake pads 1 without the car biting you back? Right? So
sorry, go on.
No. It's just something to consider, right? Like that's the thing I consider. Like brake pads 3 isn't really like a more performant pad as it is a more forgiving pad. Right? And so brake pad 1 gives you a lot of bite and a lot of grip, and it feels great. I run 1 on most of the sprint races, so I'm with you on that. Right? But in a changing condition where the grip might change, or I might be in a battle, or just thinking too much and working too hard, if I grab the brakes with brake pad 1 and just jump on the brakes, then the car will spin itself out because I'm not paying attention. Where with the brake pad 3, that initial bite is just soft enough that it's like, oh, they haven't paid attention. I can go off the brake and make some changes. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, that's the one thing that I was practicing today, is that the brake points and how much pressure I put on the brakes, and see how early the ABS kicks in. So I was trying different brake pressures for different turns to see what's the best point for me to brake as late as possible, but keeping the car under a certain control without losing my back or losing the front of the car, understeer, oversteer a lot. So I found that the brake pads 1 were easier for me to control, and with less brake pressure, not on the game but on my pedals. So
yeah, no, that makes sense. It really does. For a 30-minute race, do whatever works for you. We're not running for that long. Right. The one thing I would just keep in the back of your mind is, if you can, run around with a couple cars for a little while with brake pads 1 and adjust your brake point for where you would brake with other cars, and just kind of see where you're slowing down. Because sometimes with brake pads 3, the nice thing I find, and this is just personal preference, is that if I get on the brakes in traffic where I'm braking a little earlier, I can kind of get on the brakes as hard as I would on brake pads 1, but it lets me kind of coast into the corner because it's not so grabby. And so it gives me a little bit of leeway, right? I'm never going to be braking as deep in the corner in the wet as I am in the dry. So if I can soften my life up a little bit, that's a personal Davin preference. It's not a, oh my God, you can't run 1 in the rain, you crazy person, right? So if it's working, keep doing it, right? And if it's not working, change it.
Change it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
thank you very much.
Exactly. All right.
Can I ask a quick question about brake ducts?
What's up?
For the wet.
Yeah.
We've seen setups where the brake ducts have been opened 3 wide, so setting 5. And I was thinking it's a bit weird. Surely you're trying to keep the temperature in your brakes during the rain because it's wet.
Yep.
Is that the case? You should actually open them up.
Oh no, you actually want to close them. Yeah, you're totally right. In the wet, you want a smaller brake duct, because the brake temperature is what's keeping heat in your tire, especially in the core of it. So in the wet conditions, if I run, let's say 4 and 5 in the dry, I might run 2 and 3 in the wet, right? Because I want to keep as much heat as I can in the tire, because the water on the track is cooling down the tire already. I don't need to help it.
Yeah. Tricky then when it goes from a race where I've just had where it was wet, and I'd rather real quick and my tires were scorching.
Oh yeah, no, look man, the one of the big things about driving in the wet is that the wet doesn't stay wet forever. So you are having to be a little bit more mindful when you're making some setup changes that they're going to be compromises, right? So you nailed it, right? Like if you're driving around in the wet and you're running brake pads too, and the track dries out because you didn't check the weather, or the weather just changed because thanks God weather changes, right? Now you're going to be just shoving a lot of heat into a really soft wet tire. You're going to have a bad time, right?
I will let you know, Davin, they just did get screwed in the Euro race because it went from damp to fast in the last 10 minutes of the race.
Right.
So they all got a huge lesson in tire.
Awesome. Awesome. Right. Those are good experiences to have because it's just gonna happen, right? Like it's not a flex, but it might be a minor flex. Like if you're driving a real thing, I can't affect the weather in real life. I have to adapt to whatever the weather is giving me. So in some cases, I'm just going to have to make a compromise and say, I'm going to run a little bit more of a brake pad in the rain. I'm going to run more aggressive brake bias and just shove heat in there. It's going to suck a little bit while it's wet, but when the track dries out, it's just going to suck a little less, and the relative suck is better than what everybody else is dealing with. So I'm fine. Right.
That's one of the things that ACC is known for too, is the last 10 minutes of the race. Everything changes almost 180 degrees, and you get to figure out, like, what the hell am I going to do now?
Mm-hmm.
There's a big curve there sometimes.
Yep.
Sometimes I'll put one more little newbie question.
Sure.
When you're running dry tires, there's 5 sets. When you're running wet, there's just wet. There's no sets to work through.
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I was thinking about that yesterday. I don't remember the count of sets. I think
it's unlimited with wets. There's no set limit with wets.
There you go. Yeah, I thought the ACC didn't want to make you have to work that hard. So, yeah. Thanks, Brian. All right, let's see what else do I got in here. Nope, that's it. Questions, just general wet driving questions. Like, look, the reason why I did this format different than what we normally do for the clinics is I want you guys out driving, right? I just want to give you some more mindful things to be mindful of up front before you start driving, because most folks defeat themselves in the rain before they turn a wheel, right? They tell themselves they don't want to do it. They subconsciously psych themselves out. They tell themselves it's going to be too hard. And so then when the car gives them any sort of resistance, they kind of fold. And they're like, I don't want to do this. And then they never get fast in the rain.
Racing in the rain sucks.
Right, exactly. Racing in the rain is more about proactive confidence, right? I'm going to make this car do what I want it to do. I know I'm going to have to make some changes. We're just changing it, okay? Right? And then the more you get comfortable with doing that, you become that guy that loves racing in the rain, that's just out driving everybody because you're having fun, rather than this sucks, right? Like, if I took all your tires and cut them in half and made you run on 195-inch tires, it'd be the same thing, right? So, while doing it, all shall deal. But, you guys have any questions? I know I blew through a lot, so I'd be surprised if you didn't.
When it comes to hunting for water on the track, it's literally just a drive off the race though.
Say that again?
When you're hunting for water on a drying out racetrack, it's literally just drive off the race line and open the 3 bottles.
Sort of. It's really more of like trying to drive off the line where there's not a lot of low in the tires. You don't want to just be hunting for puddles everywhere, but it kind of depends on how fast things are drying, how hot are the tires getting, where is there standing water and can I use it, like da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So like let's say on a track that's going from light rain to dry, it would maybe make more sense to be offline for a little while, so that I can drive over the damper parts of the track that are drying out, than driving on the really dry line that will definitely burn up my tires. Right.
Yeah.
So it's a little. Yeah.
In the last race, I was trying to do that when it started to dry, but I was having difficulty actually seeing any water in the track. So I was like, is this having any effect driving off the race line when I can't actually see the bottle?
Yeah, totally. And I think that's one of those things that also falls into the category of like sim racing things, right? Because in real life, I can show you where there's water. It's damp. I can see it. I can feel the car moving around and stuff. Especially like on the light to dry when it gets greasy, I just kind of use my best judgment, right? And I kind of just drive until I feel like the tire is getting too hot, and yeah, it's more of an art than a science, unfortunately, at least for me.
As long as you see a slightly darker line, you're technically on a slightly wetter portion of the track. It doesn't have to be a silvery looking puddle to go through. It's more of you're not actually seeing the black asphalt or the blacktop, that turns into a very light gray driving line where you would want to be on a fast, optimal racing track. You want to be just off enough to get the tires to cool down, and it might be a small amount coming down, like say the front straightaway here at Barcelona. It's a really long track. You would want to be more middle track than anything, and then kind of move over a little bit before your braking area so that you can get yourself set up for the first turn. The long straightaway down the middle of the track, you're going to want to be mid-track there. And that'll be a little bit wetter than everything else because everybody's going to be running the dry line down the right side. And a lot of times it's in the straightaways you're going to be able to do it because you obviously don't want to all of a sudden jump into a puddle on a turn where you've got a high load on the outside and all of a sudden you get the smallest amount of hydroplane and then you get an oversteer and then you're really fighting to catch the car at that point.
Can you talk about OMI across the?
I mean, sure. What do we
specifically dry versus?
Oh, you mean temperature? For a temperature range?
Exactly.
I don't know the wet tire temperature range as well. I know the dry is 70 to 90, but the wet I don't know.
I know it's 40 to 70. What I've read, I'm talking about with regards to camber settings, and I know tires in the dry should have like 9 across the front, maybe 5 in the rear. Are there any rules for?
Oh, okay, I see.
He's talking about gradient across the tire.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your mic was cutting out a bit, Carter.
Sorry, I'm driving and holding press to talk.
Oh no, it's all good. It's all good. Honestly, I don't know the fine minutia about that as well as I probably should.
I've looked it up and I haven't been able to find anything as far as gradient across the tire on a wet tire.
Yeah. For me in the wet, it's more of a good enough, to be frank. I mean, throwing my hands up, right? I'm not really super scientific with tires in the wet. I get to balance, and I get for I really mostly look for car balance. I look for level of comfort in the rain, and I think about the length of the race, and I look at the tires at the end of the race, and I kind of see where I'm at. But I'm not scientific about it. Probably I should be, because
but you run the same camber as you do in the dry.
Give or take. I say that in a classroom setting, and then watch me go out and start making changes to my car immediately because I'm cranky, right? So, right, part of it kind of comes down to what balance am I trying to get out of the car at the time. I'll start with the same setup though, and then start making minor gradation adjustments as I start getting fickle, right?
Yeah, I was just asking because I read a post by Eris talking about how the wet tires have a bigger slip angle than the dry.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything happens slower with a wet tire than it does versus that, and I didn't know if that had anything to do with temperature variation and stuff.
Well, he's right because you have less tread on the ground, right? Because your tires are treaded, and so there's less rubber touching the ground than a slick tire, which is one big block, and the car is basically wobbling over these treads the whole time. So he's definitely right? It's like the equivalent of driving on a 305 tire in the dry and maybe a 255 in the wet, right? So that's a thing, but I'm not going to make you a bullshit answer if I don't have an exact answer for you, right? So
that's fair. Better have that.
Carson has a request in the rookie chat. He wants to know if we can put ballast on Carter.
Nah, that's funny.
He's too quick.
That's funny.
He's at a 56 in the rain, guys. That's pretty fucking fast.
That's fast. That's real fast.
He has been putting in the time. He has been putting in the laps. So if anybody has any questions, I'd say to check McCarter and see what he's doing.
Yeah, I mean,
Find out his little tiny adjustments he's making.
Yeah, I mean, that's the brilliance of the rookie league, right? Is that you can ask each other for setup advice. You can watch each other's lines. You can practice with each other, right? So like, don't hesitate if someone's figuring. Like I was chasing Carter around in the wet yesterday and couldn't keep up with him for shit till the track started to dry out, and then I was like, oh, thank God, right? So
yeah, you laid down a burner and then took off and said, well, I hope it rains later.
Yep. That's
also the funny part. When you left, Davin,
yep,
it began to downpour.
It was a flooded track for an hour.
The server or not?
Well, I mean, honestly, that's why I made that setup a 7-toe setup, because Carter, I was chasing you around and I just was not getting the time out of it that I thought I should, and I saw what time you were doing and I was like, I hate this. All right, 7 toes. Moving on.
Fair enough.
Right? Moving on. But that's how it works, right? Like racing, like I'm not here to be the fastest guy all the time and screw everybody else up. Like if you're doing something faster than me, I want to figure out what it is that you're doing. And so I'll chase you around, I'll watch your setup, I'll watch your driving, and I'll make some tweaks. And if I can stay close, sometimes that's all I need. Right? And so if you're on the front row and I'm a row behind you, all I have to do is chase you around for the race till you fall off.
That's been my strategy from jump.
Yep. Right? I don't need to push by you, especially in a situation where like it's raining and it's hard to drive on, right? Why do I want to make my life any harder than necessary? Right?
Exactly.
So I'm going to stick with you and, hang around and watch your driving and match what you're doing, because at least we can do that, right? And then when you fall off, or if you fall off, then I'll just drive right by and hopefully don't make the same mistake myself. Tra-la-la-la-la-la.
Yeah, don't follow the person in front of you.
Does anybody have an opinion on engine maps during like wet races? Because I've seen wet setups when they'll switch it to 3. And
there isn't one for the SD though.
Yeah, the SD doesn't have one, but for the other GT3 cars they do. Yep.
The ST only goes fast.
Yeah, it's only Italian speed. I think I threw that in here in one of the bullet maps for engine mapping. Oh yeah, bullet 6. If the car has an engine wet map, use it. Right? I said something similar about traction control earlier in the week, right? If you've got a sophisticated traction control and you can use it to make the car faster, use it. Right? I frankly do not care if the fastest way around the track for you is full traction control, full, or none. I care about the output of the result that you're getting. So, use the tools at your disposal, right? Use brake bias to make the car more comfortable. Make a setup change if you feel like it's necessary. Just give yourself some time to adapt to what the car is doing before you start just throwing a bunch of things at it, because you may end up putting yourself in a worse position because you did 2 laps and you didn't really think about it, right? Do 20, and I'm not joking. Do a lot, and then be like, the one big thing this car is doing is not turning in, or whatever it is, and I can't drive around this, making a change.
I would also recommend watching your replays.
Yep, definitely.
Is the wet engine map then a case of you're not going to be burning as much fuel in the wet because you're not going to be getting the same performance out of the car, so run a different
That depends on the car.
Carry less fuel.
That depends on the car. It's kind of like with the Mercedes in Formula One. They got what they call their happy hour kind of thing. They can burn more fuel, and it changes the timing. It also changes the total horsepower output by adjusting the throttle adjustment. There's a great big read from ARIS on that, and I can actually find that for you, Lloyd, if you want.
There's actually a wiki on the ECU maps.
Yeah, and I've got a PDF of the different maps in there too, because some of it's like per car, torque curve, how they're set up, and how they're mapped.
Yeah, mostly it's 1 through 3 are the high power, then 9 through 12 are like the safety car, and then 5 through 8 are wet.
So
Car specific, they're not all the same. Don't fall.
There's slight differences in the horsepower that comes out of them. I mean, like in the Ferrari GTO or the Evo, 1 and 3, you can feel the difference in torque in the top end. That's about it. And I mean, it's a pissed off car in map 1 versus 3 where it's somewhat tame.
And honestly, because I'm a bit of like an intermediate driver, I will find a setup, like a map that I like, and then I'll just forget, and then just drive. So
I actually switch between the two depending on the race, like 1 and 3.
I mean, that makes...
Lloyd, it's in your DM.
Like on a pass, I'll pass someone in map 1 and then go back to 3.
You're that's good. You're more attentive than me. I just leave it on map 1 and put more fuel in the car.
Either one works, man.
Yeah, right. I'm just like, whatever. I don't want to do math here.
Well, I just like being able to all of a sudden have horsepower and all of a sudden just run someone down.
Well, the
the
important thing is that you know that your car has the ability to do it, and you're taking advantage of it, right?
Exactly.
A lot of folks don't even know, right? They can change ABS, they can change engine map, they can change traction control, they can change curve and traction control, and they don't do it. And so,
if you don't have the tools, ability to change that in game, and you're competing against people, you're bringing a knife to a gunfight.
Yeah, definitely. One of those little butter knives too. So definitely with you.
Exactly.
So these test sessions are great to practice a bunch of those things, right? Like I know I gave you guidance on traction control. I know I gave you guidance on a few other things. That's just guidance. It's not gospel. So if you have something that works better for your car, like, somebody mentioned running pads 1, run pads 1. That's like, no, I'm not going to disqualify you from running different pads than me. Like, come on, right? Do what works best, but just be procedural in how you are making those changes so that you are sure that they're going to give you an added benefit. Don't trick yourself into thinking that a change is making a benefit because, you've added a bunch of roll bar and you found a second when there's still 5 seconds left, right? Find 4 of the seconds and then make a tweak. All right. So.
YOLO. Come on, just put it all on there.
Right. Well, look, I have a bad habit, and guys like Carter keep me honest, and I appreciate that, where I'll make setup changes to a car, I'll find a whole bunch of time, and I'll sit there and be like, that's as fast as the car will go. And then Carter will come in and blow me off by 2 seconds. And I'm like, that is fast as I am going in that car right now. I need to go back to the garage. Okay. Right? So being able to kind of make some of those changes. And sometimes the ability to loosen the car up to get the lap time is important, right?
Absolutely.
It's a go-karting story. But I race regionally in the area, and my wife will come with me as kind of part of the pit crew. She's kind of like pit boss. She keeps everything organized. She keeps everything comfortable. Also, I'm too busy running around driving, so I'm never the most organized and clean person.
She's got the Mexican food for everyone
else. Right,
Right,
exactly. Plus, she brings food. But the whole point of the story was that we were doing some practice laps before the race got started, and I had a setup that I wasn't very comfortable with, but I was like 4/10 faster than everybody else. And so I came back into the pits, and the first thing I was like, I hate this car. It won't turn, like, blah, 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 blah. And my wife pulls down the timing sheets, and she shows me the lap time. She's like, you just have to fucking deal with it. And I was like,
I like her already.
All right. She's like, this much lap time we won't find by making you comfortable and going slower. You're already doing the lap time. Just deal. And I'm like,
man.
All right. You heard
she
the lady.
sounds like a great pit boss. She raced too?
Yeah, no, she doesn't. But she's super competitive. I met her competitive gaming. Yeah.
She knows the strategies, man. Just deal with it.
I met her competitive gaming, so it's kind of the same thing, right? So she knows that sometimes I'm not right. And so I might want something, but it's not the right thing to get. And so
you're married, you're never right.
Yeah, I'm never right. I know, I'm never right. And so after a while I just learned to deal with sometimes when if the time is good and the car feels crappy, I just need to find a way to like it. Right? And so you'll hear me say that a lot of times to a lot of folks in the rookie league of just, deal with it.exe. Right? Because sometimes you just
absolutely. Like if you compare the Ferrari versus the McLaren's like riding a skateboard.
So, sometimes it is a matter of just dealing with it. So. Okay.
Go on, Ben.
No, I was going to say I'm about done showing PowerPoint slides. I actually want to go drive a race car soon. But I want to
I'm out here just having fun, guys, so this is great. I love the fact that there's coaching, too.
Cool. You guys have any other questions for me?
Nothing I can think
of. No, but I want to see if we can find out about the OMI for wet tires. I'm just curious if that information exists.
I also might poke around on like the SimGrid Discord and a few other Discords and ask, because I haven't looked doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? Just see.
Well, you kind of blew my mind when you said you run the same camber, so I was like, oh shit, I took out almost a half a degree of camber on my setup, so I just added 2/10 back, and I was like, God, there's gobs of grips now.
Yeah, I mean that's also me being lazy, right? There's a little bit of that where like I run
I'm lazy as shit, dude. I own a pug, and he and I are very similar. So
I know. Now you said that, I know that, right? My wife's a vet tech for her day job, so she keeps telling me all the dogs I can't have. So, but yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I start with that because I know the setup works on the dry. I also know that if the track starts to dry back out, I still have a setup that'll work with me, right? At some condition, the setup will be good, and so if I make big changes and the track changes too, then I've hurt myself. Right.
Well, exactly. For me, a big change is one click in one direction.
Yep, one click in one direction. Exactly right. So, cool. Alrighty. Well, I'm gonna stop recording this.
Well, Devin, that's awesome, man. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah,
That's great info.
no problem. Was this helpful for everybody, or was it just me talking for an hour?
No, it's great.
No, it was helpful.
Of course it was helpful.
Awesome.
Good stuff as always, Devin.
Good deal.